The call came at 9:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. I was sitting in the emergency room with a split lip, bruised ribs, and a dislocated shoulder that had just been popped back into place by a doctor who smelled like coffee and looked like he hadn't slept in 3 days. My car was wrapped around a guardrail somewhere off Highway 26, taillights shattered across wet asphalt like broken stars. The airbag had saved my life, but it had also left my face looking like I'd gone 10 rounds with a heavyweight champion. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I was alone, shaking from shock, and all I needed was someone to drive me home. I scrolled through my contacts with my good hand, thumb hovering over the names that should have mattered most. Mom. Dad. Tori. I called my sister first. She answered on the 4th ring, her voice bright and distracted, like she was at a dinner party or maybe just scrolling through her phone while half watching a reality show. When I told her what happened, when I explained that I was hurt and stranded and just needed a ride across town, there was a pause so long I thought the call had dropped. Then she said, and I'll never forget the way her voice stayed light, almost amused, "Nat, I'm in the middle of something. Can't you just get an Uber?" That's when I knew. Not just that she wouldn't come, but that I had never really mattered at all. My name is Natalie Brooks, and that night in the emergency room was the beginning of the end of my family. Or maybe it was just the moment I finally stopped pretending we were one. The hours leading up to the accident had been ordinary in the way that makes tragedy feel even more surreal. I'd driven out to the coast that afternoon to clear my head after another exhausting week at the community center where I worked as a social worker. The Oregon coastline in October is cold and gray and beautiful in a way that makes you feel small, and I needed that. I needed to feel like my problems were just tiny grains of sand in an infinite stretch of shore. I'd walked along Cannon Beach until my fingers went numb, watched the waves chew at Haystack Rock, and tried not to think about the family dinner I'd been uninvited from the week before. Tori had been hosting something at her loft in the Pearl District, some kind of launch party for her wellness brand, and my mother had called 2 days before to gently suggest that maybe it would be better if I didn't come. She didn't say why. She didn't have to. I was the daughter who worked with troubled teens in a part of town my parents referred to as still developing, while Tori ran a boutique lifestyle company funded by our parents and frequented by women who paid $200 for a candle. I didn't fit the aesthetic. I never had. The drive back from the coast should have taken 2 hours. I'd left just before sunset, thinking I'd beat the worst of the evening traffic and be home in time to microwave some leftovers and collapse into bed. But the rain started just past Tillamook, the kind of heavy coastal rain that turns Highway 26 into a river with lanes. My windshield wipers could barely keep up. I was careful, hands tight on the wheel, going 10 miles under the speed limit like a paranoid driving instructor. It didn't matter. The pickup truck that ran the red light at the intersection near the ranger station didn't see me, or didn't care, and by the time I registered the headlights coming at me from the wrong direction, it was too late to do anything but brace. The impact was a sound I'll carry forever, metal folding in on itself like aluminum foil, glass exploding into 1,000 tiny diamonds. My head snapped forward and then back, and the airbag punched me in the face hard enough to make my ears ring. For a few seconds, maybe longer, I couldn't hear anything except a high-pitched whine and my own ragged breathing. When I finally managed to push the deflated airbag away and look around, I saw steam rising from the hood of my car and the taillights of the truck that hit me disappearing around the bend. He didn't stop. He just kept driving. A couple in a Subaru pulled over and called 911. The woman, maybe in her 50s with kind eyes and a fleece jacket, stayed with me until the ambulance arrived, holding my hand and telling me I was going to be okay even though I could see the fear in her face. The paramedics were efficient and calm, asking me questions I barely registered. "What's your name? Do you know what day it is? Can you move your fingers?" They loaded me onto a stretcher and into the back of the ambulance, and I watched the wreckage of my car shrink into the distance through the back window. It had been a 2011 Honda Civic, nothing fancy, but it was paid off and it was mine. Now it was just twisted metal and shattered dreams sitting on the shoulder of a dark highway. At Mercy General, they wheeled me through sliding doors that hissed open like the entrance to some sterile purgatory. The ER was busy, filled with the sounds of beeping machines and low conversations and someone somewhere crying in a language I didn't recognize. A nurse with a nose ring and purple scrubs checked my vitals while a doctor examined my shoulder, which had dislocated on impact. The pain was breathtaking, a hot searing thing that made me want to vomit. They gave me something for it, some kind of painkiller that made the edges of the room go soft, and then the doctor counted to 3 and popped my shoulder back into place with a sound like a branch snapping. I may have screamed. I'm not sure. After that, they sent me for x-rays to make sure nothing was broken, then back to a bed in the ER where I sat alone under fluorescent lights that made my skin look gray and dead. That's when I made the calls. First to Tori, because she lived closest, only 15 minutes away in her renovated loft with the exposed brick and the view of the Willamette River. I thought maybe, just maybe, this would be different. An emergency. A real reason to show up. But her response, that casual dismissal, that suggestion to just get an Uber like I was asking her to pick up dry cleaning and not rescue me from a hospital after nearly dying, it hit harder than the airbag had. I sat there staring at my phone after she hung up, and I felt something inside me go cold and still. I called my mother next. Diane Brooks answered on the second ring, her voice already tight with irritation, like I'd interrupted something important. When I told her about the accident, about the hospital, about needing help, she sighed. Actually sighed. Then she said, "Natalie, your father and I are at a fundraiser downtown. It's a very important event for the firm. Can't you call a friend?" I wanted to laugh. I wanted to scream. Instead, I just said quietly, "I'm hurt, Mom. I'm in the emergency room." Because the truth was, I'd been thinking about exactly that. About all the times I'd been left out, forgotten, dismissed. About the birthday party when I was 12 that my parents forgot because they were busy with Tori's volleyball tournament. About the college graduation where they left early to make it to Tori's art show opening. About the Christmas 2 years ago when they gave Tori a check for $20,000 to help with her business and gave me a gift card to Target. I'd told myself it didn't matter. That I was being sensitive. That families were complicated. But sitting in Linda's office, with my shoulder still aching and my face still bruised, I couldn't pretend anymore. "I think you're right," I said quietly. Linda nodded. "So the question is, what are you going to do about it?" I didn't have an answer yet. But I was starting to realize that maybe I needed to find one. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop and a cup of tea that had gone cold an hour ago. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, just that I needed to understand something, anything, about why my family treated me the way they did. I started with the obvious places: social media, old emails, photo albums stored in my cloud. And that's when I started seeing it. The pattern Linda had mentioned. In every family photo from the last 5 years that my parents had posted online, I was either cropped out or missing entirely. There was the Christmas card from 3 years ago, the one they'd sent to all their business contacts. It featured my parents and Tori in front of the fireplace, all matching sweaters and perfect smiles. I'd been there that day. I remembered because my mother had yelled at me for wearing the wrong shade of red. But in the final version, I was gone. Edited out. Erased. There was the photo from my father's 60th birthday party, a big formal event at a hotel ballroom downtown. In the album my mother had posted on Facebook, there were 43 photos. Tori appeared in 39 of them. I appeared in 2, and in both, I was partially blocked by other people, just a shoulder or the side of my face visible in the background. I kept scrolling. Every vacation, every holiday, every major event. The pattern was undeniable. I wasn't just being left out. I was being deliberately removed. And the more I looked, the angrier I got. Not the hot, explosive kind of anger, but something colder, sharper. The kind of anger that comes with clarity. They hadn't forgotten about me. They had chosen to erase me. And I was done pretending it was an accident. I spent the next week digging through everything I could find. Old bank statements I'd saved in a folder labeled taxes and boring stuff, family emails going back a decade, text message threads I should have deleted years ago but never did. I wasn't looking for anything specific at first, just trying to understand the scope of what had been done to me. But the more I searched, the more I found, and what started as a vague sense of wrongness began to solidify into something concrete and undeniable. The first real discovery came on a Saturday morning. I was going through old emails, the kind you never actually read but also never delete because they feel important somehow. Forwards from my mother about family logistics, reminders about events, updates about Tori's various accomplishments. Most of it was mundane, the digital detritus of a family that looked normal on the surface. But then I found a thread from 2 years ago, right around the time my grandmother Ruth had passed away. She'd been my father's mother, a tough woman who'd survived the Depression and 2 bad marriages and had come out the other side with a cabin on the Columbia River Gorge and a sharp tongue that didn't suffer fools. I'd loved her fiercely, maybe because she was the only person in the family who ever seemed to see me clearly. She'd left me things in her will. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I knew because she'd told me herself, sitting on her porch 6 months before she died, watching eagles circle over the river. She'd gripped my hand with her papery fingers and said, "Natalie, I'm leaving you the cabin. Not your sister, not your parents. You. Because you're the only one who ever visited me without wanting something." I'd cried and told her not to talk like that she had years left. She just smiled and said, "Don't be stupid, girl. I'm 89. I've had a good run." When she died, my parents had handled everything. The funeral, the estate, the legal paperwork. They'd told me the will was being processed, that these things took time, that I'd get my share eventually. I'd believed them because why wouldn't I? They were my parents. They'd managed the family finances for decades. They knew what they were doing. But sitting there at my kitchen table with my laptop screen casting blue light across my bruised face, I found an email chain that made my blood run cold. It was between my mother and someone named Patricia Weston, an estate attorney whose name I vaguely remembered from the funeral. The subject line read, "Ruth Brooks Estate, Revised Distribution." I clicked it open. The first email was from my mother, dated 3 weeks after the funeral. "Patricia, thank you for meeting with us yesterday. As we discussed, we'd like to proceed with the revised distribution plan. Given Natalie's current life circumstances and financial instability, Richard and I believe it would be more prudent to transfer the Columbia River property to Victoria, who has the resources and business acumen to properly maintain it. We'll handle informing Natalie at the appropriate time. Please prepare the necessary documentation. Best, Diane." I read it 3 times, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. Financial instability. Life circumstances. The appropriate time. They'd stolen my inheritance. Not through some complicated legal loophole, but through a simple lie. They'd told the attorney I was unstable, unfit, incapable. And because they were the executors of the estate, because they had power of attorney, because the lawyer had no reason to question them, it had worked. I scrolled down to Patricia's response. "Diane, I understand your concerns, but I should note that Ruth's will was quite explicit about her wishes regarding the property. She specifically named Natalie as the sole beneficiary of the cabin and its contents. Changing this distribution would require Natalie's consent or a legal finding of incompetence. I'm not comfortable proceeding without proper documentation. Please advise. Patricia Weston, attorney at law." My mother's reply came 2 hours later. "Patricia, we appreciate your diligence. However, I should clarify that Natalie has been struggling with some personal issues that she prefers to keep private. She's already indicated to us informally that she doesn't feel equipped to handle property ownership at this time. Rather than put her through the stress of formal proceedings, we thought a quiet transfer to her sister would be the best solution for everyone. We'll obtain her signature on the necessary forms. I can have them to you by Friday. Thank you for your understanding. Diane." It was all lies. Every single word. I hadn't struggled with personal issues. I hadn't indicated anything to anyone. I certainly hadn't agreed to give up the one thing my grandmother had wanted me to have. But my mother had said it with such confidence, such authority, that the attorney had backed down. The rest of the email chain was procedural. Forms sent back and forth, notarization details, transfer documents. And then, buried in an attachment labeled Final Estate Distribution, I found it. My signature. Or rather, something that was supposed to be my signature, scrawled at the bottom of a form titled Voluntary Property Transfer Agreement. I stared at it, my vision blurring at the edges. The signature looked close enough at first glance. Same general shape, same first initial flourish. But it wasn't mine. The loop on the lowercase was wrong, too tight and too high. The tail on the E didn't curve the way mine did. Someone had forged my signature, probably my mother or Tori, someone who'd seen my handwriting enough times to make a decent approximation. And it had worked because nobody had bothered to verify it. Nobody had called me to confirm. Nobody had asked if I actually wanted to give away my inheritance. I saved everything. Downloaded the entire email chain, took screenshots, saved the attachments to 3 different folders. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely work the trackpad, but I forced myself to be methodical. This wasn't just family drama anymore. This was fraud. Forgery. Theft. Criminal acts dressed up in legal language and filed away in someone's office like they were nothing. When I finally closed the laptop, the apartment was dark except for the glow from my phone charging on the counter. I looked at the time. It was past midnight. I'd been sitting there for 6 hours, and I hadn't eaten anything since breakfast. I wasn't hungry. I was something else, something I didn't have a name for yet. That night I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my grandmother's face, heard her voice telling me the cabin was mine. She'd wanted me to have it not because it was valuable, though the property was probably worth $500,000 at least, but because she knew I'd appreciate it. Because I'd spent summers there as a kid, helping her weed the garden and paint the shutters and sit on the dock watching the sun set over the water. Because I understood what it meant to her, that little piece of independence she'd carved out of a hard life. And they'd taken it from me like it was nothing. Like I was nothing. The next morning, I called Linda. I knew I wasn't supposed to bother my therapist outside of our scheduled sessions, but I didn't know who else to talk to. She answered on the 3rd ring, her voice calm despite the early hour. When I told her what I'd found, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then she said, "Natalie, I need you to listen to me very carefully. What you've just described is not a family conflict. It's a crime. You need to speak with an attorney immediately." I nodded even though she couldn't see me. I know. I just needed to tell someone. I needed someone to confirm I wasn't crazy. Her voice softened. "You're not crazy. You're not imagining this. And you deserve to have someone in your corner who will fight for you." After we hung up, I sat on my couch and stared at the wall for a long time. Part of me wanted to confront them immediately, to call my mother and scream at her until my voice gave out. But another part of me, the part that had been growing colder and sharper since the night in the emergency room, knew that wouldn't accomplish anything. They would deny it. They would spin it. They would make me look unstable, just like they'd told the attorney. I needed proof. I needed leverage. I needed to be smart about this. So instead of calling my family, I called Marcus. He came over that afternoon with coffee and bagels and the kind of focused energy that told me he was ready for whatever came next. I showed him everything. The emails, the forged signature, the property transfer documents. He read through it all twice, his jaw getting tighter with each page. When he finally looked up at me, his eyes were dark with anger. "They stole from you." I nodded. "They stole from me." He leaned back in his chair and ran his hands through his hair. "Okay. So what do we do?" I appreciated the "we" more than he probably knew. "I need a lawyer. Someone who handles estate fraud. Do you know anyone?" Marcus thought for a moment, then nodded. My aunt used a lawyer a few years ago when her ex tried to hide assets during their divorce. Woman named Linda Vasquez. No, wait, that's your therapist. Damn, I always mix them up. The lawyer was Claudia Morrison. Morrison and Associates downtown. Supposed to be a shark. I wrote down the name. Can you get me her number? He was already pulling out his phone. I'll do you one better. I'll call my aunt right now and get you a recommendation. She owes me for helping her move last summer. While Marcus made the call, I walked to the window and looked out at the street below. It was a gray Monday, typical Portland weather, the kind of day where the clouds hung so low you felt like you could reach up and touch them. People walked by with umbrellas and coffee cups, living their normal lives, dealing with their normal problems. I wondered what it felt like to have normal problems. To worry about traffic or deadlines or what to make for dinner, instead of worrying about whether your family had systematically erased you from existence. Marcus hung up and gave me a thumbs up. Got it. Claudia Morrison. My aunt says she's expensive but worth every penny. She's texting me the number now. I took a deep breath. Okay. I'll call her tomorrow. Marcus looked at me seriously. Nat, you know this is going to blow up your family, right? Like, this isn't something you can come back from. I met his eyes. I know. But they blew up my family the night they left me in the emergency room. I'm just making sure everyone else knows about it. The next morning, I called Morrison and Associates at exactly 9 o'clock. The receptionist who answered had the kind of professional warmth that made you feel like your problem was both important and solvable, a neat trick that probably took years to master. I explained that I needed to speak with Claudia Morrison about an estate fraud case, and she put me on hold with music that sounded like it was designed to make you feel both calm and wealthy. 2 minutes later, a voice came on the line. Deep, confident, with just a hint of a southern accent. This is Claudia Morrison. I understand you have an estate matter you'd like to discuss. I'd rehearsed what I was going to say a dozen times, but sitting there with the phone pressed to my ear, all my carefully prepared words evaporated. Instead, I just said, my family forged my signature to steal my inheritance, and I found the emails to prove it. There was a brief pause. Then Claudia said, well, that's certainly direct. I appreciate that. How soon can you come to my office? We scheduled an appointment for that afternoon. I spent the morning organizing all my documentation, printing out the emails, highlighting the relevant sections, preparing a timeline of events. I wanted to look competent, professional, like someone who deserved to be taken seriously. By the time I walked into Morrison and Associates' office on the 20th floor of a downtown high-rise, I had a folder 3 inches thick and a determination that felt like armor. Claudia Morrison was not what I expected. I'd pictured someone older, severe, with reading glasses and a power suit. Instead, she was maybe 40, with natural hair pulled back in a sleek bun and a smile that was equal parts warm and dangerous. She shook my hand with a grip that could crack walnuts and gestured to the chair across from her desk. So, Natalie. Tell me everything. I told her. About my grandmother, about the cabin, about the emails and the forged signature and the night in the emergency room that had started this whole unraveling. I showed her the documentation, walked her through the timeline, explained the relationship dynamics that had led to this moment. She listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes on a yellow legal pad, her expression unreadable. When I finally finished, she sat back in her chair and steepled her fingers. This is straightforward fraud. The forged signature alone is enough for both criminal and civil action. The question is, what do you want? I blinked. What do I want? She nodded. Do you want the property back? Do you want financial compensation? Do you want criminal charges filed? Do you want to destroy your family's reputation? Because depending on how we proceed, any or all of those things are possible. I thought about it. What did I want? A week ago, I would have said I just wanted them to acknowledge what they'd done, to apologize, to somehow make it right. But sitting in Claudia's office, looking at the evidence of their betrayal laid out in black and white, I realized that wasn't enough anymore. I want everything, I said quietly. I want the cabin back. I want them held accountable. I want everyone to know what they did. Claudia smiled, and it was the kind of smile that made me glad she was on my side. Then let's get to work. The next 2 weeks were a crash course in legal warfare. Claudia moved fast, filing an emergency injunction to prevent any further transactions involving the cabin, submitting the forged documents to the county prosecutor's office for investigation, and preparing a civil lawsuit for fraud and conversion. Every step was calculated, strategic, designed to back my family into a corner before they even realized they were under attack. I stayed away from them during this time. Ignored their texts, didn't return calls, avoided the places I knew they'd be. My mother left me a voicemail on Wednesday saying she hoped I was recovering well from my accident and that we should have lunch soon. The casual tone of it, like nothing had happened, like she hadn't abandoned me in an emergency room and stolen my inheritance, made me want to throw my phone across the room. Instead, I saved the voicemail. Evidence of her continued indifference. Claudia had taught me that everything could be evidence if you looked at it the right way. I also started documenting everything else I could find. The cropped photos, the excluded invitations, the financial disparities. Tori's business had been funded almost entirely by our parents, more than $200,000 over 3 years according to bank statements I found in an old shared family account I still had access to. Meanwhile, when I'd asked for help with a down payment on a car 2 years ago, my father had told me I needed to learn financial responsibility. I made spreadsheets. I organized files. I became a meticulous accountant of my own erasure, and with every document I added to the growing pile, I felt something shift inside me. I wasn't a victim anymore. I was building a case. Marcus came over most nights, bringing takeout and moral support and occasionally just sitting with me while I worked in silence. He didn't try to talk me out of it, didn't suggest that maybe I should just let it go for the sake of family peace. He understood that some things couldn't be let go, that some betrayals were too fundamental to forgive. One night, while we were eating Thai food on my couch and I was cross-referencing dates on bank statements, he said, "You know your family is going to lose their minds when this hits, right?" I looked up from my laptop. "Good." He grinned. "That's my girl." On the 15th day after my first meeting with Claudia, she called me with news. The prosecutor's office is moving forward with the fraud investigation. They've issued a subpoena for your parents' financial records and communications with Patricia Weston. And the judge granted our injunction. The cabin can't be sold, transferred, or mortgaged until this is resolved. I closed my eyes and felt something like relief wash over me. So it's really happening. Her voice was firm. It's really happening. And Natalie, you should prepare yourself. Your family is about to find out about all of this, and they're not going to take it well. I thought about my mother's voicemail, about Tori's breezy text messages, about my father's silence. I don't think they've taken me seriously in years. Maybe it's time they started. The call came 2 days later. I was at work, meeting with a teenager named Jamal who was trying to decide whether to go back to his foster home or try to make it on his own. We were talking about the pros and cons, about resources and support systems, when my phone buzzed with a call from my mother. I ignored it. She called again immediately. Then again. Then my father called. Then Tori. I excused myself from the meeting, told Jamal I'd be right back, and stepped into the hallway. My phone was buzzing like an angry hornet. I answered my mother's 5th call. Before I could say anything, she launched in, her voice tight and high with barely controlled fury. "What have you done, Natalie? What the hell have you done?" I kept my voice calm. "I filed a lawsuit to recover property that was stolen from me." There was a sound that might have been a gasp or a laugh, I couldn't tell. "Stolen? We didn't steal anything. We protected you. We made decisions that were in your best interest because you weren't capable of making them yourself." There it was. The lie she'd told herself so many times she actually believed it. "You forged my signature, Mom. You took something Grandma Ruth left specifically to me and gave it to Tori. That's not protection. That's theft." Her voice went icy. You're making a terrible mistake. This will destroy this family. I looked down at my hand, at the scar on my knuckle from the accident, at the bruise that was finally starting to fade. No, Mom. You destroyed this family. I'm just making sure everyone knows about it. I hung up before she could respond. My hands were shaking, but not from fear. From something else. Something that felt almost like power. That night, my apartment buzzer rang at 9 o'clock. I checked the video intercom and saw Tori standing in the lobby, her face makeup perfect even at this hour, her expression stormy. I almost didn't let her up. But curiosity won out, or maybe some stubborn part of me still wanted to hear what she had to say. I buzzed her in and opened my door, waiting while she climbed the 3 flights of stairs to my floor. She was breathing hard when she reached the landing, though whether from exertion or emotion I couldn't tell. We stood there for a moment, facing each other in the dim hallway light. She looked different somehow, smaller maybe, or less sure of herself. Can I come in? She asked. I stepped aside without saying anything. She walked past me into the apartment, looking around like she was seeing it for the first time, even though she'd been here before, years ago, for a housewarming party I'd thrown when I first moved in. She'd stayed for 20 minutes, complimented the hardwood floors in a tone that made it clear she found them inadequate, and left for a better party across town. Now she stood in the middle of my small living room, surrounded by my second-hand furniture and my case files and the life I'd built without her help, and for a moment she looked lost. Nat, we need to talk about this lawsuit. I crossed my arms. No, we don't. She turned to face me. Yes, we do. You're destroying everything. The business, the foundation, Mom and Dad's reputation. Do you have any idea what this is going to do to us? I felt something cold and sharp settle in my chest. Do you have any idea what you did to me? What you've all been doing to me for years? She blinked. What are you talking about? I walked to my laptop, still open on the coffee table, and pulled up one of the folders I'd created. I'm talking about this. I clicked through images. The Christmas card where I'd been cropped out. The birthday party photos where I was missing. The family vacation albums where I didn't exist. I'm talking about being erased from every family memory like I was never there. I'm talking about being left out of events, left off invitations, forgotten about until someone needed something from me. Tori's face had gone pale. Nat, that's not, I cut her off. I'm talking about calling you from the emergency room after a car accident that could have killed me and having you tell me to get an Uber. I'm talking about Mom and Dad going to a fundraiser instead of picking up their daughter from the hospital. I'm talking about Grandma Ruth leaving me the cabin because she knew I was the only one who gave a damn about her, and then having you and Mom forge my signature to steal it. Her mouth opened and closed. We didn't forge anything. Mom said you agreed. I laughed, and it came out bitter. And you believed her? You didn't think to ask me yourself? You didn't think it was weird that I'd just give away the one thing Grandma specifically wanted me to have? She looked away. I thought maybe you needed the money. That maybe you'd sold your share to me. I pulled up the transfer documents, showed her the signature. Does that look like my handwriting to you? She stared at it for a long time. Then, quietly, no. We stood there in silence. I waited for her to say something else, to apologize, to acknowledge what had been done. Instead, she said, "What do you want, Nat? Money? We can pay you for the cabin. Just drop the lawsuit." And that's when I knew. She didn't understand. She couldn't understand. Because in her world, everything had a price, and every problem could be solved by throwing money at it. She'd never had to fight for anything, never had to prove she was worthy of basic consideration. She'd always been enough just by existing. I don't want your money, Tori. I want what's mine. And I want everyone to know what you did to get it. Her eyes hardened. Fine. But don't expect to be part of this family anymore. I smiled, sad and tired. I haven't been part of this family in a long time. I'm just making it official." She left without another word, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood as she walked to the door. I listened to her footsteps fade down the stairwell, listened to the building door slam shut, and then I sat down on my couch and stared at nothing for a long time. My phone buzzed with texts. Angry messages from my father, pleading ones from my mother, each one trying a different tactic to get me to back down. I didn't respond to any of them. Instead, I forwarded them all to Claudia with a brief note. "More evidence of harassment." She replied within minutes. "Perfect. Keep them coming. They're building our case for us." The lawsuit became public record 3 days later. I hadn't expected it to make news, figured it would just be another filing in the endless churn of the legal system. But apparently, when a prominent family that runs a successful marketing firm gets accused of fraud and forgery, people pay attention. The first article appeared in the Portland Tribune, a short piece in the business section titled, "Brooks Family Faces Estate Fraud Allegations." It was mostly factual, outlining the basic claims of the lawsuit without much editorial comment. But it was enough. By that afternoon, my phone was ringing with calls from numbers I didn't recognize. Reporters, probably, looking for a statement. I ignored them all, following Claudia's strict instructions not to speak to anyone about the case. My mother had no such restrictions. By evening, she'd given an interview to a local lifestyle blogger who covered the Portland social scene, the kind of person who wrote fawning profiles of wealthy families and their charity work. The blog post was titled, "A Family in Crisis, Diane Brooks Speaks Out," and it was a masterclass in spin. According to my mother, I was a troubled young woman who had struggled with mental health issues for years. The family had tried to help me, had supported me financially and emotionally, but I'd become increasingly unstable and resentful of my sister's success. The property dispute was a misunderstanding, a result of my confusion and inability to manage complex legal matters. They'd been trying to protect me, to handle the estate quietly without embarrassing me, but I'd lashed out. It was tragic, really. They still loved me. They just wanted me to get the help I needed. I read the blog post 3 times, feeling my face grow hot with each pass. Every sentence was carefully crafted to make me look irrational, to plant doubt in anyone who might be following the story. Mental health issues. Unstable. Troubled. Words designed to discredit anything I might say, to make people think twice before believing me. Marcus was at my apartment within an hour of the post going live. He didn't knock, just used the spare key I'd given him years ago and walked in to find me sitting at my kitchen table with my laptop open, reading the comments section beneath my mother's interview. People I'd never met were discussing my mental state, debating whether I was a victim or a villain, sharing their own stories about difficult family members who just couldn't let things go. "Stop reading that," Marcus said, gently closing my laptop. "It's garbage and you know it." I looked up at him. "She told everyone I'm crazy." He pulled out a chair and sat down across from me. "She told everyone she's desperate." "Which means you're winning." I wanted to believe him. But sitting there with my mother's words echoing in my head, all her careful implications and strategic phrasing, I felt something start to crack. What if people believed her? What if the judge believed her? What if my entire case fell apart because she'd managed to convince everyone that I was just an unstable daughter with a grudge? Marcus must have seen something in my face because he reached across the table and grabbed my hand. "Nat, listen to me. You have documentation. You have emails with timestamps. You have a forged signature that any handwriting expert can verify isn't yours. You have facts. She has a blog post. Facts win." I took a shaky breath. "Do they? Because it feels like she just poisoned the entire jury pool before we even get to trial." He squeezed my hand. "Then we document this too. We show that she's trying to discredit you publicly because she knows she's guilty. It's just more evidence of their pattern of behavior." I nodded slowly, trying to absorb his logic. He was right. I knew he was right. But knowing something intellectually and believing it emotionally were 2 different things. I called Claudia and told her about the blog post. She was silent for a moment, and I could hear papers rustling in the background. Then she said, "Well, that was stupid of her." Despite everything, I almost laughed. Stupid? Claudia's voice was dry. "Natalie, your mother just gave a public interview claiming you're mentally unstable while we have documented evidence that she committed fraud. She's essentially arguing that you're too incompetent to manage your own affairs, which is going to make it very interesting when we present proof that she had to forge your signature because you were completely competent and would have said no. She just handed us a gift." I felt some of the tension leave my shoulders. "So this doesn't hurt our case?" She made a dismissive sound. "It helps our case. It shows consciousness of guilt. If they had nothing to hide, they wouldn't be launching a smear campaign. Save that blog post. Print it out. Add it to the file. And Natalie, do not, under any circumstances, respond publicly. Let them keep talking. Every word they say just digs the hole deeper." That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the city filtering through my window. Cars passing on the street below, someone's music playing faintly from another apartment, the distant wail of a siren heading somewhere urgent. I thought about my grandmother, about the last conversation we'd had on her porch. She'd been dying and we both knew it, even though neither of us said it out loud. Instead, we talked about the river, about the eagles that nested in the tall pines along the bank, about the way the light turned golden in the late afternoon. She'd told me about buying the cabin in 1987, scraping together money from her job as a nurse and a small settlement from her second divorce. It had been a wreck when she got it, half the roof missing and raccoons living in the kitchen. But it had been hers, and she'd spent 2 decades turning it into something beautiful. "Your mother never understood why I cared so much about this place," Ruth had said, her voice papery with age. "She thought I should sell it, invest the money, be practical. But some things aren't about money, Natalie. Some things are about having a space in the world that's yours, where nobody can tell you who to be or what to want." She'd looked at me then, her eyes still sharp despite the cancer eating through her body. "That's why I'm leaving it to you. Because you understand that. And because your sister would just turn it into another business venture, another thing to photograph and brand and sell to strangers. I'd promised her I'd take care of it. That I'd keep the garden going, that I'd watch the eagles, that I'd sit on that porch and remember her. And now I couldn't even visit it without risking arrest for trespassing on property that should have been mine." The preliminary hearing was scheduled for a Friday morning in early November. Claudia had explained that this wasn't the trial, just a proceeding to determine whether there was enough evidence to move forward. The bar was low, she'd assured me. We just needed to show probable cause that fraud had occurred. But as I walked up the courthouse steps that morning, my stomach was twisted in knots. This was real now. Not just emails and documents, but an official legal proceeding where I'd have to face my family and make public accusations that couldn't be taken back. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, more like a large conference room than the dramatic spaces you see on television. Wood paneling, uncomfortable benches, fluorescent lights that made everyone look slightly ill. My family was already there when I arrived, sitting on the left side of the room with their attorney, a man in an expensive suit whose name I couldn't remember. My mother sat straight-backed and composed, her hands folded in her lap. My father stared at the table in front of him. Tori was scrolling through her phone, her face carefully blank. None of them looked at me as I took my seat on the opposite side with Claudia. The judge entered, a woman in her 60s with gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and reading glasses perched on her nose. She looked tired, like she'd already heard a dozen cases that morning and ours was just another item on an endless list. But when she started reading through the case summary, her expression sharpened. Claudia stood and presented our evidence methodically. The emails between my mother and Patricia Weston. The forged signature. The original will naming me as beneficiary. The property transfer documents. Expert testimony about handwriting analysis. She walked the judge through the timeline, showing how my parents had used their position as executors to manipulate the estate distribution, how they'd lied to the attorney about my consent, how they'd enriched my sister at my expense. My family's attorney tried to counter, arguing that this was a family dispute being blown out of proportion, that there had been verbal agreements that superseded the written will, that I'd been consulted and had agreed to the arrangement. But when the judge asked for documentation of these verbal agreements, for any written record of my consent, he had nothing. Just assertions and implications and carefully worded suggestions that maybe I'd been confused, maybe I'd misunderstood, maybe my mental state at the time had affected my memory of events. Claudia destroyed that argument in less than 5 minutes, presenting my employment records showing stable full-time work, character references from my supervisors, even my therapist Linda's written statement confirming that I showed no signs of cognitive impairment or incompetence. Every piece of evidence was time-stamped, notarized, official. By the time she finished, the judge was looking at my parents with an expression that could have frozen water. When it was my turn to testify, I stood and walked to the witness stand on legs that felt disconnected from my body. I swore to tell the truth, sat down, and met Claudia's eyes. She gave me a small nod. We'd practiced this. I knew what to say. She asked me about my relationship with my grandmother, about the conversations we'd had about the will, about my knowledge of the estate proceedings. I answered each question clearly, keeping my voice steady even when I wanted to scream. Then she asked about the night of the accident, about calling my family from the emergency room, about their responses. I saw my mother's face tighten, saw Tori shift uncomfortably in her seat. Can you tell the court what happened when you called your sister Victoria from the hospital? Claudia asked. I looked directly at Tori. I told her I'd been in a serious car accident. That I was hurt and alone at Mercy General. That I just needed someone to pick me up and drive me home. My voice didn't waver. She told me she was in the middle of something and suggested I get an Uber. The courtroom was silent. Even the court reporter had stopped typing for a moment. Claudia nodded. And when you called your parents? I turned to look at them now, at my mother's rigid posture, at my father's inability to meet my eyes. My mother said they were at a fundraiser and couldn't leave. She told me I was strong enough to handle it on my own and to call them the next day. The judge leaned forward slightly. You were injured in a car accident and your family refused to pick you up from the hospital? I nodded. Yes, Your Honor. She wrote something down, her pen moving sharply across the paper. Continue, Ms. Morrison. Claudia walked me through the rest of it. Finding the emails, discovering the forged signature, realizing the full scope of what had been done. With each answer, I watched my parents shrink a little more in their seats, watched their attorney's face grow more grim. When Claudia finished, my family's attorney stood for cross-examination. He tried to rattle me, asking pointed questions about my relationship with my sister, implying jealousy and resentment, suggesting I was exaggerating the family dynamics for sympathy. But every time he pushed, I pushed back with facts. Dates. Documentation. Specific incidents I'd recorded in journals or saved in emails. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't get emotional. I just told the truth, clearly and completely, until he finally gave up and sat down. The judge took off her glasses and rubbed her eyes. Then she looked at my parents and said, I've reviewed the evidence presented today, and I'm frankly appalled. The documentation of fraud is clear and convincing. The forgery is obvious to anyone with basic knowledge of handwriting analysis. And the pattern of behavior described by the plaintiff suggests a systematic effort to exclude and diminish her within the family structure. She turned to me. Ms. Brooks, I'm granting your motion to proceed to trial. Additionally, I'm issuing an order that the property in question be held in trust pending the outcome of these proceedings, and I'm referring this matter to the district attorney's office for potential criminal prosecution. She looked back at my parents. I suggest you consult with your attorney about the wisdom of settling this matter before it goes any further. The gavel came down and I sat there stunned, not quite believing what had just happened. Claudia touched my arm and leaned in close. We won, she whispered. That was as close to a victory as you can get at a preliminary hearing. I nodded, still trying to process. Around me, people were standing, gathering their things, filing out of the courtroom. My family left quickly, not looking back, their attorney trailing behind them with his briefcase and his expensive suit and his defeated posture. As I walked out into the courthouse hallway, I felt my phone buzz with a text from Marcus. "How'd it go?" I replied, "We won." Before I could put my phone away, it rang. Unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. "Is this Natalie Brooks?" a woman's voice asked. "Yes." She introduced herself as a producer for a local news station, said she'd been following the case and wanted to know if I'd be interested in giving an interview. I looked at Claudia, who was watching me with raised eyebrows. "I need to think about it," I told the producer. "Can I call you back?" She gave me her number and we hung up. Claudia was already shaking her head. "Bad idea. We don't need media attention right now." But I wasn't so sure. My mother had tried to control the narrative with that blog post, had tried to make me look unstable and vindictive. Maybe it was time to tell my side of the story. Not through lawyers and legal filings, but directly. In my own words. "What if I want to do it?" I asked. Claudia sighed. "Then we prepare very carefully. Because once you go public, there's no taking it back." I thought about it all weekend. Marcus came over on Saturday with pizza and beer, and we talked through the pros and cons. He was surprisingly supportive of the idea, thought it might help counteract my mother's smear campaign. Linda was more cautious when I brought it up in our therapy session, worried about the emotional toll of going public, of opening myself up to criticism and judgment from strangers. But in the end, the decision was mine. On Monday morning, I called the producer back and agreed to the interview. We scheduled it for Wednesday, 2 days away, which gave me time to prepare with Claudia. She drilled me on message discipline, on staying calm, on not getting defensive or emotional even if the questions were hostile. "Stick to the facts," she kept saying. "Don't speculate about their motives. Don't attack them personally. Just tell your story and let people draw their own conclusions." The interview was conducted in a small studio downtown, just me and a reporter named Jennifer Chen who had kind eyes and a direct manner I appreciated. She started with softball questions, background about my family and my grandmother, establishing context. Then she moved to harder territory. "Your mother has said publicly that you've struggled with mental health issues. How do you respond to that?" I looked directly at the camera. "It's not true. I've been in therapy since the accident, which I think shows healthy coping, not instability. I have a full-time job working with at-risk youth. I pay my bills, maintain my relationships, function normally in every way. The only thing I've struggled with is accepting that my family has been systematically excluding me for years." Jennifer nodded. "Can you give us specific examples of that exclusion?" I walked her through it. The cropped photos, the missed birthdays, the financial disparities, the night in the emergency room. With each example, I kept my voice level, stuck to facts, didn't editorialize. When I got to the part about discovering the forged signature, Jennifer's eyebrows rose. "So you're alleging that your mother committed fraud?" I chose my words carefully, remembering Claudia's coaching. "I'm saying that the signature on those documents isn't mine, and the court has agreed there's sufficient evidence of forgery to proceed to trial. The facts speak for themselves." The interview lasted 45 minutes. When it was over, Jennifer thanked me and said it would air that evening on the 6 o'clock news. I went home and tried not to obsess about it, but by 5:30 I was planted on my couch with Marcus beside me, both of us staring at the television like it might explode. The segment ran as the second story, right after a piece about city budget issues. They'd edited it down to about 6 minutes, interspersed with shots of the courthouse and a brief statement from my family's attorney saying they stood by their position that this was a misunderstanding. But mostly it was me, talking calmly about betrayal and forgery and the night my family left me alone in a hospital. When it ended, Marcus let out a long breath. "Well, you definitely told your side." My phone started ringing almost immediately. More reporters, people I hadn't talked to in years, even a few distant relatives I'd forgotten existed. I let most of it go to voicemail, but I did answer when Uncle Paul called. He was my father's younger brother, someone I'd always liked but rarely saw. "Natalie," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I just watched your interview. I had no idea things were that bad. I felt my throat tighten. Nobody did. That was kind of the point. He was quiet for a moment. Your father called me about an hour ago. Wanted me to reach out to you, try to convince you to drop the lawsuit. He's worried about the family reputation. I laughed, bitter and sharp. Of course he is. Uncle Paul sighed. I told him I wouldn't do it. Told him that if even half of what you're saying is true, you have every right to fight back. He didn't like that much. We talked for a few more minutes, and before we hung up, he said something that stuck with me. Your grandmother would be proud of you. She never let anyone push her around either. After the call ended, I sat in the dark living room, the television now off, and let myself feel everything I'd been holding back. The fear, the anger, the grief for a family that had never really been mine. Marcus had left an hour ago, reminding me to call if I needed anything, and now I was alone with the weight of what I'd just done. I'd gone public. I'd told my story to thousands of people. There was no going back from this. The response to the interview was overwhelming. By the next morning, the video had been shared hundreds of times on social media, picking up traction in online communities dedicated to family estrangement and narcissistic abuse. People I'd never met were commenting, sharing their own stories of being excluded by family, expressing support or sometimes criticism. Some thought I was brave. Others thought I was vindictive. A few suggested I was just as bad as my parents for airing family issues publicly. I tried not to read the comments, but it was like picking at a scab. I couldn't help myself. One comment in particular got under my skin, from someone with a profile picture of a golden retriever and a username like Sunny Days Ahead. It said, there are always two sides to every story. Maybe she was a difficult child and the parents did their best. Not everything is abuse. I wanted to respond, to explain that yes, there were two sides, but one side involved forged documents and the other involved me trying to survive. But Claudia's words echoed in my head. Don't engage. Let the facts speak. So I closed the laptop and went to work, where at least the problems were other people's and I knew how to help. My supervisor pulled me aside around midday, her expression concerned. Natalie, I saw the news last night. Are you okay? Do you need some time off? I shook my head. I need to work. I need normal. She studied my face for a moment, then nodded. Okay. But if that changes, you let me know. The kids I worked with didn't watch the local news, so they had no idea what was happening in my personal life. That was a relief. I spent the afternoon helping a girl named Destiny fill out job applications, mediating a dispute between two boys who'd been feuding over something I never quite understood, and reviewing case files for my caseload. Normal problems. Solvable problems. By the time I left the office, I felt almost steady again. Then I got home and found Tori waiting outside my building. She was leaning against the brick wall near the entrance, arms crossed over her chest, looking every bit the successful entrepreneur in her tailored coat and leather boots. When she saw me approaching, she straightened up, and I could see the tension in her shoulders, the tight set of her jaw. For a moment, we just looked at each other across the sidewalk, two sisters who'd grown up in the same house but might as well have lived in different worlds. I walked past her toward the door, fishing my keys from my bag. She followed without asking permission, and I heard her footsteps behind me as I climbed the 3 flights to my apartment. Inside, I dropped my bag on the counter and turned to face her. She stood in the middle of my living room, looking smaller somehow than she had outside, less certain. That interview was cruel, she said finally, her voice low and controlled. You made us look like monsters. I moved to the kitchen, filling a glass with water just to have something to do with my hands. I told the truth. If the truth makes you look like monsters, maybe you should think about why that is. She flinched slightly, but recovered quickly. You told your version of the truth. You left out all the context, all the reasons behind the decisions that were made. I took a sip of water, studying her over the rim of the glass. What context? What possible reason justifies forging someone's signature to steal their inheritance? Tori's face flushed. We didn't think of it that way. Mom said you'd agreed, that you'd talked about it and decided you didn't want the responsibility of maintaining the property. She handled the paperwork and I assumed it was all legitimate. I set the glass down carefully, fighting to keep my voice level. You assumed. You didn't ask me yourself. You didn't think it was strange that Grandma Ruth specifically left the cabin to me, not you, and that I would just change my mind and hand it over? She looked away, her fingers twisting the strap of her designer handbag. I thought maybe you needed the money more than the property. That selling your share to me made sense for you financially. It was almost funny, the way she could rationalize anything if it benefited her. Tori, if I'd sold you my share, there would have been a check. Money changing hands. Did you write me a check? Her silence was answer enough. I pressed on. No, you didn't. Because you didn't buy anything. It was just transferred to you, free and clear, while I got nothing. And you never questioned that because it benefited you not to question it. She turned back to me, and for the first time I saw something that might have been genuine emotion in her eyes. I'm here because I want to fix this. What do you want? Money? The cabin? An apology? Just tell me what it will take to make this go away. I felt something twist in my chest. Even now, even after everything, she thought this was a transaction. Something that could be resolved with the right offer, the right combination of words and concessions. I want the cabin back. I want it legally transferred to my name, the way Grandma Ruth intended. I want a public acknowledgement that the signature was forged and that I never consented to any of this. And I want you to understand that what you all did to me wasn't just about property. It was about erasing me from the family, over and over again, until I barely existed. Tori shook her head slowly. The public acknowledgement part, that's what Mom and Dad will never agree to. It would destroy the business. All their clients, their reputation, everything they've built would be gone. They'd rather fight this all the way to trial than admit fault publicly. I leaned against the counter, suddenly tired. Then I guess we're going to trial. She took a step toward me, her voice rising. Why are you being so stubborn about this? We're family. We're supposed to work things out privately, not drag each other through court and media and public humiliation. The laugh that came out of me was sharp and hollow. Family. You want to talk about family? Where was family when I called you from the hospital? Where was family every time I got cropped out of photos, left off invitations, excluded from decisions? You want privacy now, but you had no problem publicly erasing me for years. Her face crumpled slightly, and I saw her blink rapidly, fighting tears. I didn't realize it was that bad. I thought you were just sensitive, that you took things too personally. Mom always said you had a tendency to feel left out even when you weren't. I stared at her, feeling a strange mix of anger and pity. And you believed her. You never once thought to ask me how I felt, to check if maybe Mom's version of me wasn't accurate. You just accepted the narrative that I was the problem. Tori wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand, smudging her mascara. I don't know what you want me to say, Nat. I can't go back and change the past. I can only deal with now. I softened slightly, not because I forgave her but because I could see she was genuinely struggling, caught between loyalty to our parents and some dim recognition that they might have been wrong. Then deal with now. Tell me the truth. Did you know the signature was forged? She was quiet for so long I thought she might not answer. Then, barely audible, I suspected something wasn't right. The timing was weird, the way Mom rushed everything through. But I didn't want to know for sure because then I'd have to do something about it. There it was. The truth I'd been waiting for. She'd known, or at least suspected, and she'd chosen to look the other way because confronting it would have been inconvenient. I felt the last thread of hope for our relationship snap cleanly. You need to leave now. She looked up, startled. Nat, please, we can still figure this out. I walked to the door and opened it, my hand steady on the knob. No, we can't. Because you're still choosing them over what's right. You're still more worried about the business and the reputation than about the fact that your family committed fraud. Until that changes, we have nothing to talk about." She stood there for another moment, looking lost and young despite her expensive clothes and perfect hair. Then she walked to the door, pausing just before she stepped into the hallway. "I am sorry. For what it's worth." I met her eyes. "It's worth exactly nothing unless you're willing to back it up with action. And we both know you won't." She left without another word, and I closed the door behind her, leaning my forehead against the cool wood. My hands were shaking, adrenaline flooding my system now that the confrontation was over. I'd meant every word I said, but saying it had cost me something. Whatever small hope I'd harbored that my sister might actually choose me, might actually stand up to our parents for once, was gone now. The weeks leading up to the trial were a blur of preparation and anxiety. Claudia had me reviewing documents constantly, preparing for cross-examination, going over timelines until I could recite them in my sleep. We met with handwriting experts who analyzed the forged signature, with financial analysts who traced the property transfer, with character witnesses who could testify to my competence and stability. Every piece of evidence had to be perfect, every argument airtight. My parents hired a bigger firm, brought in attorneys from Seattle who specialized in estate litigation. They were throwing money at the problem, trying to bury me in legal maneuvers and procedural delays. But Claudia was relentless, countering every motion, pushing the case forward with the determination of someone who knew she was on the right side. The trial was set for January, just after the new year. As the date approached, I found myself swinging between confidence and terror. Some days I was certain we'd win, that the evidence was too clear for any other outcome. Other days I was convinced the judge would somehow side with my parents, that their money and connections and carefully constructed image would win out over documentation and facts. Marcus kept me grounded during those weeks, showing up with food when I forgot to eat, dragging me out for walks when I'd been staring at documents too long, reminding me that I was doing the right thing even when it felt impossible. Linda helped me process the emotional weight of it all, the grief of losing my family alongside the determination to hold them accountable. One evening in mid-December, I was walking home from a late session with Claudia when I passed a coffee shop near Pioneer Courthouse Square. Through the window, I saw my father sitting alone at a corner table, staring into a cup of something that had probably gone cold. He looked older than I remembered, his shoulders hunched, his face drawn with exhaustion. For a moment, I considered going in. Talking to him without lawyers present, without the weight of legal proceedings between us. Maybe he'd be more honest, more real, without my mother there to script his responses. But even as I thought it, I knew it was pointless. My father had made his choice years ago, had decided that maintaining peace with my mother was more important than standing up for his younger daughter. He was an enabler, complicit through silence and inaction. Whatever he might say to me now would just be more excuses, more justifications, more careful deflections of responsibility. I kept walking, leaving him to his cold coffee and whatever thoughts kept him sitting alone in that window. The first snow of the season fell on New Year's Eve, turning Portland into something quiet and strange. I spent the evening at Marcus's apartment with a handful of friends, people who knew about the trial but had the grace not to bring it up unless I did. We played card games and ate too much food and watched the ball drop on television, and for a few hours, I felt almost normal. Almost like a person whose life wasn't about to be dissected in court. The trial started on January 8th, a Monday that dawned gray and cold. I wore a navy suit that Marcus had helped me pick out, professional but not flashy, the kind of thing that said I was serious and competent and not trying too hard. Claudia met me on the courthouse steps, looking sharp and black with her leather briefcase and her game face on. "Ready?" she asked. I took a deep breath of freezing air. "No. But let's do it anyway." The courtroom was more crowded than I'd expected. Beyond my family and their legal team, there were reporters in the back rows, a few people I recognized from the online communities that had been following the case, even Uncle Paul sitting quietly on my side of the room. The presence of witnesses made it feel more real, more final. Judge Catherine Morrison, no relation to my attorney despite the shared name, presided with the same serious demeanor she'd shown at the preliminary hearing. She was in her late 60s, with a reputation for being fair but exacting, the kind of judge who didn't tolerate theatrics or procedural games. After the opening formalities, Claudia stood to give her opening statement. She was magnificent, walking the jury through the case with clarity and precision. She explained what should have happened, how my grandmother's will was clear and unambiguous in leaving me the cabin. She showed them what actually happened, the forged signature, the fraudulent transfer, the enrichment of my sister at my expense. And she connected it to the larger pattern, the years of exclusion and erasure that set the context for this final betrayal. When she finished, even the reporters in the back were leaning forward, engaged. My family's attorney was a man named Gerald Pritchard, silver-haired and smooth-voiced, the kind of lawyer who made you feel like he was your friend even while he was destroying your case. His opening statement was all about family complexity, about difficult decisions made with good intentions, about misunderstandings and miscommunications that had been blown out of proportion by hurt feelings. He painted me as a troubled daughter who'd never quite fit in, who'd resented her sister's success and used this property dispute as revenge. It was skillfully done, planting doubt without making explicit accusations, suggesting rather than stating. When he sat down, I felt the old familiar fear creeping in. What if it worked? What if people believed their version? The prosecution of the case took 3 days. Claudia called witness after witness, building the evidence brick by brick. The handwriting expert who showed definitively that the signature wasn't mine, pointing out specific differences in letter formation and pen pressure. The estate attorney Patricia Weston, who testified that she'd been uncomfortable with the transfer but had relied on my mother's assurances that I'd consented. Financial analysts who showed the paper trail of the property going from the estate to my sister without any compensation flowing back to me. And then character witnesses. My supervisor from work, testifying to my reliability and competence. Linda Vasquez, carefully navigating the boundaries of therapist-client privilege to confirm that I showed no signs of the mental instability my family had claimed. Even Uncle Paul, who spoke quietly about family dynamics he'd observed over the years, the way I'd always been treated as secondary to my sister. Through it all, my parents sat rigid and stone-faced, my mother's hand occasionally reaching over to grip my father's. Tori stared at her lap, her face pale. When it was finally my turn to testify, I felt strangely calm. I'd been preparing for this moment for weeks, had rehearsed my testimony until the words felt like a script. But when I sat in the witness box and looked out at the courtroom, at the judge and the jury and the reporters and my family, I realized I didn't need a script. I just needed to tell the truth. Claudia walked me through it gently, establishing the basic facts first. My relationship with my grandmother, our conversations about her wishes, the specific promises she'd made about the cabin. Then the discovery of the emails, the realization that my signature had been forged, the growing awareness that this wasn't an isolated incident but part of a pattern. She asked about the night of the accident, and I told that story again, hearing my own voice stay steady as I described calling my sister from the emergency room and being told to get an Uber. I saw one of the jurors, a middle-aged woman in the front row, press her lips together tightly, and I knew the story had landed. When Claudia asked about the years of exclusion, I didn't have to exaggerate or embellish. I just described it, matter-of-factly, the way you might describe the weather. The cropped photos, the missed events, the financial disparities. I brought out specific examples, showed the jury actual photos where I'd been edited out, read excerpts from emails where plans were made without including me. With each piece of evidence, I watched the jury's faces shift from neutral to concerned to something that looked like anger. Then it was Gerald Pritchard's turn for cross-examination. He stood up slowly, buttoning his suit jacket with the kind of theatrical precision that made me brace for impact. He started with softball questions, confirming basic facts, lulling me into a rhythm. Then he pivoted. Ms. Brooks, isn't it true that you've struggled with feelings of inadequacy compared to your sister for most of your life? I kept my voice level. I've struggled with being treated as less important than my sister. That's not the same as inadequacy. He raised his eyebrows. But you've admitted to feeling left out, excluded. Couldn't those feelings be your own perception rather than reality? I met his eyes. When you're literally cropped out of photos, that's not perception. That's reality. He shifted tactics. You work as a social worker, correct? A noble profession, but not as financially successful as your sister's business ventures. Isn't it possible that envy played a role in your decision to file this lawsuit? Claudia started to object, but I shook my head slightly. I wanted to answer this. If I envied my sister's business success, I could have started my own business. I chose social work because I care about helping people who've been marginalized and forgotten. The irony isn't lost on me that I ended up being marginalized by my own family. Several jurors nodded, and I saw Pritchard's jaw tighten. He asked more questions, trying different angles, but I'd spent too much time preparing for this. Every attack he made, I had documentation to counter. Every implication, I could refute with facts. After 45 minutes, he finally gave up and sat down, and I could see from his face that he knew the cross-examination hadn't gone the way he'd hoped. My mother took the stand the next day. She wore a pale gray suit and pearls, her hair perfectly styled, her makeup flawless. She looked like the kind of woman you'd trust to run a charity gala or organize a school fundraiser, elegant and composed and utterly sympathetic. Pritchard walked her through her version of events. How I'd been a difficult child, sensitive and prone to imagining slights. How they'd tried to include me but I'd always pulled away, preferring to play the victim rather than participate. How the property transfer had been done with my verbal consent, just not properly documented because they'd trusted it was a family matter that didn't need formal paperwork. She cried when she talked about the lawsuit, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue and saying how much it hurt to be accused of something so horrible by her own daughter. It was a performance, expertly delivered. I watched the jury watching her, trying to gauge if they were buying it. Some looked sympathetic. Others looked skeptical. When Claudia stood up for cross-examination, I felt my whole body tense. This was it. The moment everything could fall apart or come together. Claudia started gently, asking my mother to confirm basic facts. Then she pulled out the emails, printed on large boards so the whole courtroom could see them. Mrs. Brooks, do you recognize this email exchange? My mother glanced at them, her composure flickering. Yes, those are emails between myself and our estate attorney. Claudia nodded. Can you read the highlighted portion for the court? My mother's voice was tight as she read her own words about me being financially unstable, about handling the transfer quietly, about obtaining my signature. When she finished, Claudia said, "You testified that Natalie gave verbal consent to this transfer. But in this email, you say you'll obtain her signature, future tense. If she'd already consented, wouldn't you have already had her signature?" My mother stammered slightly. It was just poor wording. I meant I would obtain the formal documentation of what we'd already discussed. Claudia pulled out another exhibit, the document with the forged signature. Mrs. Brooks, we've heard testimony from a handwriting expert that this signature is not consistent with your daughter's actual handwriting. Did you sign this document in Natalie's name? My mother's face went red. Absolutely not. I would never do such a thing. Claudia's voice remained calm, almost gentle. Then who did? You were the executor of the estate. You controlled all the paperwork. You admitted in emails that you were handling the transfer. If you didn't forge the signature, who had access and motive to do so? My mother looked at Pritchard desperately, but he couldn't help her. She was trapped by her own emails, her own words. I don't know, she said finally. Perhaps there was an administrative error. Claudia let that hang in the air for a moment, the absurdity of the claim evident to everyone. Then she moved to the personal attacks. Mrs. Brooks, you've given interviews suggesting your daughter has mental health issues. What evidence do you have for that claim? My mother straightened slightly, regaining some composure. A mother knows her child. Natalie has always been fragile, overly emotional. Claudia pulled out more exhibits. My employment records, showing consistent work history. Letters from supervisors praising my performance. Linda's statement. Medical records showing no psychiatric diagnoses. Given all this evidence of stability and competence, wouldn't you say your characterization of your daughter was inaccurate? My mother's lips pressed into a thin line. I stand by my assessment. Claudia nodded slowly. One final question, Mrs. Brooks. When your daughter called you from the emergency room after her car accident, why didn't you leave the fundraiser to pick her up? The courtroom went silent. My mother looked trapped, her eyes darting between Pritchard and the judge. It was an important event. I assumed she was exaggerating the severity of the situation. Claudia's voice remained gentle, but there was steel underneath. Your daughter's car was totaled. She had a dislocated shoulder and facial injuries. The medical records are in evidence. In what way was she exaggerating? My mother had no answer. Claudia let the silence stretch for several seconds before saying, "No further questions." The defense called their own witnesses over the next day and a half. Friends of the family who testified that I'd always seemed distant and difficult. Business associates who spoke glowingly of my parents' character. Even a psychologist who'd never met me but offered expert testimony about how people with certain personality traits might perceive rejection where none existed. Claudia methodically dismantled each witness, showing the bias in their testimony, the lack of first-hand knowledge, the irrelevance of character evidence in the face of documentary proof. When Tori took the stand, I sat forward, wondering what she'd say. She looked miserable, her usual polish dulled, dark circles under her eyes despite her makeup. Pritchard asked her about our childhood, about family dynamics, about the property transfer. She gave careful answers, trying to thread the needle between supporting our parents and not outright lying under oath. But when Claudia cross-examined her, asking directly if she'd ever questioned the legitimacy of the signature, Tori hesitated too long. I trusted my mother to handle the legal aspects, she said finally. Claudia pressed. But did you ever ask your sister directly if she'd agreed to transfer the property? Tori looked down. No. It was enough. That admission, combined with everything else, painted a picture of a family that had conspired to cut me out, that had benefited from the fraud even if some members had only been willfully blind to it. The closing arguments came on Friday afternoon. Pritchard went first, making an impassioned plea about family complexity, about mistakes made in good faith, about the tragedy of a family torn apart by misunderstandings. He urged the jury to see this as a civil matter, not a criminal conspiracy, and to remember that real people's lives and reputations were at stake. Claudia's closing was shorter but more powerful. She simply walked through the evidence again, showing the forged signature, reading the incriminating emails, displaying the photos where I'd been erased. She reminded the jury that this wasn't about family drama but about fraud, about theft, about the systematic diminishment of a person until she was nearly invisible. And then she turned to me, still sitting at the plaintiff's table, and said, "Natalie Brooks is not invisible. She's right here. And she deserves justice." The jury deliberated for 6 hours. I spent that time in a small conference room with Claudia and Marcus, unable to eat, unable to think about anything except what was happening behind those closed doors. When the bailiff finally came to tell us they'd reached a verdict, my legs nearly gave out. We filed back into the courtroom. My family was already there, looking exhausted and grim. The jury filed in, not looking at either side. Judge Morrison asked the forewoman if they'd reached a unanimous decision. She confirmed they had. Then she read the verdict. The words seemed to come from very far away, filtered through the rushing sound in my ears. Guilty of fraud. Guilty of forgery. Guilty of conversion of property. The property was to be returned to me immediately. My parents were ordered to pay restitution for legal fees and damages. The judge was referring the case to the district attorney for potential criminal prosecution. I heard my mother make a sound, something between a gasp and a sob. My father sat completely still, his face gray. Tori had her hands pressed to her mouth. On my side of the courtroom, Marcus let out a breath he must have been holding for hours. Uncle Paul nodded once, firm and satisfied. Claudia squeezed my shoulder and leaned in close. We won. It's over. But it didn't feel over. It felt like standing in the wreckage after an explosion, surrounded by pieces that could never be put back together. Judge Morrison spoke, her voice cutting through the murmur that had filled the courtroom. She addressed my parents directly, her tone cold with disapproval. In my 30 years on the bench, I have rarely seen such a clear-cut case of familial exploitation. You used your position as executors to defraud your own daughter, you forged legal documents, and when confronted with your actions, you attempted to discredit the victim through a public campaign of character assassination. This behavior is not only illegal but morally reprehensible. She turned to me. Ms. Brooks, the property known as the Columbia River Cabin is hereby restored to your sole ownership, effective immediately. All transfer documents executed without your genuine consent are void. Additionally, the defendants are ordered to pay you $250,000 in damages, plus all legal costs incurred in pursuing this action. The gavel came down with a sharp crack that made me flinch. It was done. Actually, finally done. The courtroom erupted into motion. Reporters rushed for the doors, already typing on their phones. My family's legal team huddled together, speaking in low, urgent tones. Claudia was shaking hands with the lead juror who'd stopped to offer congratulations on her way out. I just sat there, feeling disconnected from my own body, watching it all happen like I was underwater. Marcus pulled me to my feet and wrapped me in a hug so tight I could barely breathe. "You did it," he said into my hair. "You actually did it." Uncle Paul came over, his eyes shiny with emotion he was trying hard to contain. "Your grandmother would be so proud. She always said you had more backbone than anyone gave you credit for." I managed a weak smile. "Thanks for being here. It meant a lot." He glanced over at my father, still sitting motionless at the defense table. I should go talk to him. Not to take their side, just to make sure he doesn't do anything stupid. "But Natalie, you call me if you need anything. Anything at all." After he left, Claudia finished gathering her materials and turned to me with a satisfied expression. "The district attorney's office will be in touch about the criminal case. That's out of our hands now. But as far as the civil matter goes, we're done. The cabin is yours. The money will be transferred within 30 days per the court order. You won." I nodded, still trying to process. "What happens now?" She smiled. "Now you go home. You rest. You let yourself feel whatever you need to feel. And then you figure out what you want to do with your life, free from all this." It sounded so simple when she said it. Just go home and be free. As if freedom was something you could simply step into like a new pair of shoes. I left the courthouse through a side exit, avoiding the reporters clustered at the main doors. Marcus drove me home through streets that looked exactly the same as they had that morning, even though everything had changed. Back at my apartment, I stood in the middle of the living room, looking at the space that had been my headquarters for this war. The files stacked on every surface, the timeline taped to the wall, the folders of evidence that had consumed my life for months. It all seemed surreal now, like artifacts from someone else's life. "You want me to stay?" Marcus asked from the doorway. I shook my head. "I think I need to be alone for a bit. Process everything." He studied my face, making sure I was really okay, then nodded. "Call me later. Or tomorrow. Whenever." After he left, I made tea I didn't drink and sat on the couch as the winter afternoon faded into evening. My phone buzzed with messages from people who'd heard the news. Congratulations, expressions of support, a few reporters still trying to get statements. I ignored all of it. What I kept thinking about, strangely, was a conversation I'd had with my grandmother years ago. I must have been 16 or 17, sitting on her porch and complaining about something my mother had done. Ruth had listened patiently, then said something I hadn't understood at the time. Some people spend their whole lives trying to earn love from people who aren't capable of giving it. The trick is figuring out when to stop trying and start building your own life instead. I'd asked her what she meant, and she just smiled and changed the subject. Now I understood. She'd been telling me what she'd learned the hard way, through bad marriages and difficult relationships and eventually choosing solitude over compromise. She'd been warning me that my family might never be what I needed them to be, and that was okay as long as I didn't waste my life waiting for them to change. The cabin was mine now. Legally, officially, mine. But I hadn't been there since before my grandmother died, hadn't even driven past it since discovering the fraud. Part of me was afraid to go, afraid it wouldn't live up to my memories or that it would be too painful to see it again. But a bigger part of me knew I needed to. It was a Saturday morning in late January when I finally made the drive. The Columbia River Gorge was stark and beautiful in winter, the hills covered in dead grass, the river gray and swift between its banks. I took the familiar turnoff, followed the narrow road that wound through pine trees, and pulled up in front of a cedar-shingled house that looked smaller than I remembered but exactly right. The key was where the lawyer had said it would be, in a lockbox by the back door. My hands shook as I opened it, feeling the weight of the old brass key that my grandmother had handled thousands of times. Inside, the cabin was dusty and cold but intact. The furniture was still arranged the way Ruth had left it, her books still on the shelves, her pottery still lining the kitchen windowsill. It smelled like wood smoke and pine and something indefinably her. I walked through slowly, touching things. The kitchen table where we'd played cards on rainy afternoons. The fireplace where she'd taught me to build a proper fire, showing me how to arrange kindling and logs for the best burn. The bedroom overlooking the river where she'd sat in her last months, watching eagles and reading mystery novels. On the mantel, I found a photo I'd forgotten about. Me at maybe 12, standing on the dock with a fishing pole, grinning at the camera with a gap in my teeth and my hair in wild tangles. My grandmother had taken that photo, I remembered now. We'd spent the whole day trying to catch anything at all, and I'd finally hooked a tiny perch that we'd thrown back. She'd been so proud, like I'd landed a marlin. I picked up the photo and sat down on the old couch, and finally, for the first time since the verdict, I cried. Not angry tears or bitter ones, just grief for everything that had been lost and relief that at least this one thing had been saved. I spent the rest of the day cleaning, opening windows to air the place out despite the cold, sweeping away cobwebs and mouse droppings, making the cabin livable again. It was therapeutic, the simple physical work of it, the sense of reclaiming space that had been stolen. By evening, I had a fire going and the kitchen table cleared, and I sat there eating a sandwich I'd brought from town, looking out at the river as the last light faded. My phone buzzed. A text from Marcus asking how I was doing. I sent back a photo of the view from the cabin with the caption, "I'm home." He responded immediately with a string of heart emojis and the words, "About damn time." I smiled, feeling something in my chest loosen slightly. Maybe Claudia had been right. Maybe this was what freedom felt like. Not triumphant or glorious, just quiet and real and mine. Over the next few weeks, I fell into a routine. Work during the week in Portland, then driving out to the cabin on weekends to continue renovating and settling in. I repainted the shutters, fixed loose boards on the deck, cleaned out the garden beds in preparation for spring planting. Uncle Paul came out one Saturday with tools and helped me repair the dock, and we spent the afternoon in companionable silence, working and occasionally talking about nothing important. The criminal investigation into my parents moved forward without my active involvement. The district attorney's office kept me updated, but mostly I stayed out of it. That was their fight now, not mine. I heard through Uncle Paul that my father had resigned from the marketing firm, that my mother was seeing a therapist, that Tori had closed her wellness business and taken a job with a company in Seattle. Their lives were unraveling in ways that might have given me satisfaction months ago but now just made me sad. In March, I got a letter. Actual paper, in an envelope with a stamp, delivered to the cabin's mailbox. The return address was my parents' house, and the handwriting was my father's. I almost threw it away unopened, but curiosity won out. The letter was short, less than a page, his handwriting shaky like he'd written it several times, and this was the final attempt. It didn't say much. That he was sorry. That he understood if I couldn't forgive him. That he'd been weak, had let my mother make decisions he should have questioned, had chosen the path of least resistance rather than doing what was right. He didn't make excuses or try to minimize what had been done. He just acknowledged it and said he hoped someday I might be willing to talk to him, but he understood if that day never came. I read it twice, then put it in a drawer with other documents from that period of my life. I didn't respond. Maybe I would eventually, or maybe I wouldn't. The important thing was that I didn't have to decide right now. The choice was mine to make on my timeline, and there was freedom in that. Linda and I talked about it in therapy. About forgiveness and what it meant, about whether you owed it to people who hurt you or whether it was something you gave yourself rather than them. She didn't push me toward any particular answer, just helped me think through what I actually wanted versus what I felt obligated to want. "Do you want a relationship with your father?" she asked during one session. I thought about it for a long time. I want him to understand what he did. To really understand, not just intellectually but in his gut. I want him to feel what it was like to be erased, to be the child who didn't matter. Linda nodded slowly. And if he does understand? If he truly grasps the harm and sits with that knowledge? Does that change anything? I didn't have an answer. The truth was, I didn't know what I wanted from him. Maybe nothing. Maybe that was okay too. Spring came to the gorge in a rush of green, wildflowers erupting across the hillsides, trees leafing out in that bright new growth color that only lasted a few weeks. I planted the garden, putting in the same vegetables my grandmother had grown, following the patterns she'd established over decades. Tomatoes in the sunniest spot, peas along the fence, herbs in pots by the kitchen door. It felt like honoring her, like keeping alive the things she'd cared about. One Sunday in April, I was weeding the garden when I heard a car pull up. I stood, wiping dirt from my knees, and saw Tori getting out of an unfamiliar sedan. We hadn't spoken since the trial, hadn't even texted. I'd seen from her social media that she'd moved to Seattle, but I hadn't expected her to show up here. She walked over slowly, her hands in her jacket pockets, looking uncertain in a way I'd never seen her look before. "Hey," she said when she reached the garden gate. "Hey." We stood there awkwardly for a moment. Then she said, "The place looks good. You've done a lot of work." I glanced around at the repainted shutters, the repaired dock, the neat garden rows. "Yeah. It's been therapeutic." She nodded. "I came to apologize. A real apology, not the half-hearted one I gave before. What we did to you was unforgivable. What I did, going along with it, believing Mom's version of things without checking, taking the cabin without questioning how I got it. All of it was wrong and I'm sorry." I leaned against the fence, studying her face. She looked different. Older maybe, or just more real. Less polished and perfect, more human. "Okay," I said finally. "I accept your apology." She looked surprised. "Just like that?" I shrugged. "You apologized. I accept it. That doesn't mean I trust you or that we're going back to how things were. I don't think we can ever have that kind of relationship. But I accept that you're sorry." Tori nodded, blinking rapidly. "That's fair. More than fair, actually." She hesitated, then asked, "Can I ask what you're going to do with this place? Are you going to live here full-time?" I looked out at the river, at the view my grandmother had loved. "I don't know yet. Maybe eventually. Right now I'm keeping my apartment in Portland for work, but I spend weekends here. It feels right, being here." She followed my gaze. I never understood why Grandma Ruth loved it so much. It always seemed so isolated to me, so far from everything. But I think I get it now. Sometimes you need distance to figure out who you are without everyone else's expectations crowding you. It was possibly the most insightful thing I'd ever heard her say. Yeah. That's exactly it. We talked for a few more minutes, carefully, like people learning to walk on ice. She told me about her new job, about therapy she'd started, about slowly realizing how unhealthy our family dynamics had been. I told her about the garden, about plans to maybe rent the cabin out as a retreat space for other people who needed distance and quiet. When she left, we didn't hug, but we did say we'd stay in touch. I wasn't sure if we actually would, but the possibility felt less impossible than it had. The criminal case against my parents was resolved in June with a plea agreement. They pled guilty to fraud and forgery in exchange for probation, community service, and restitution. No jail time, which the prosecutor said was typical for first-time offenders in white-collar cases. Part of me was disappointed they wouldn't face harsher consequences. But another part was relieved the whole thing was finally, truly over. I didn't attend the sentencing hearing. I'd given my victim impact statement in writing, and that felt like enough. I didn't need to see them standing before a judge, didn't need the satisfaction of watching them face consequences. I just needed to move forward. By summer, the cabin had become my sanctuary. I'd cut back my hours at work to part-time, using the settlement money to give myself space to figure out what I actually wanted to do with my life. I was thinking about going back to school, maybe getting a degree in counseling with a focus on family estrangement and trauma. There were so many people out there going through versions of what I'd experienced, and so few resources that actually understood the complexity of it. Marcus came out to visit regularly, sometimes bringing friends, turning the cabin into a gathering place in a way my grandmother would have loved. We'd cook meals together, sit around the fire pit I'd built near the dock, talk about everything and nothing. Uncle Paul became a regular presence too, showing up with his tools whenever I mentioned needing to fix something, claiming he needed projects to keep himself busy in retirement. The space was filling up with new memories, good ones that didn't erase what my grandmother had built here but added to it. One evening in late July, I was sitting on the dock watching the sunset paint the river gold when my phone rang. Unknown number, but I answered anyway. Natalie? This is Patricia Weston. I was your grandmother's estate attorney. I sat up straighter, surprised. Yes, I remember you. Her voice was warm but professional. I wanted to reach out because something came to my attention that I thought you should know about. When I was going through old files after the trial concluded, I found a letter your grandmother had left with me. She'd instructed me not to give it to you until after the estate was fully settled. With the criminal case now resolved, I believe that condition has been met. Would you like me to mail it to you? My heart started beating faster. Yes, please. Send it to the cabin address. The letter arrived 3 days later in a thick cream-colored envelope with my name written in my grandmother's unmistakable handwriting, all sharp angles and confident strokes. I held it for a long time before opening it, somehow knowing that whatever was inside would be important. When I finally slit the envelope open, 2 pages fell out, covered in Ruth's writing. The date at the top was from 6 months before she died. My dearest Natalie, the letter began. If you're reading this, it means Patricia has done her job and the estate has been properly settled. It probably also means that things got complicated, because I know your mother and I know how she operates. I'm leaving you the cabin, as I've told you. But I'm also leaving you this letter because there are things I need you to understand. Your mother is my daughter-in-law, and I tried for many years to see the good in her, to believe that her need for control and perfection came from her own wounds. Maybe it does. But regardless of the reasons, I watched her systematically diminish you from the time you were small, and I didn't do enough to stop it. That's my failure, and I'm sorry for it. I thought that leaving you the cabin would be enough, that having this place would give you a foundation to build your own life separate from their expectations. But I realize now that you might need more than property. You might need permission. So here it is, my darling girl. Permission to walk away. Permission to choose yourself over family loyalty. Permission to build a life that makes you happy even if it disappoints them. Permission to be angry about what was done to you. Permission to grieve for the family you deserved but didn't get. You don't owe them forgiveness. You don't owe them a relationship. You don't owe them anything except what you freely choose to give. The cabin is yours not because I think you need a house, but because I wanted you to have a place in this world that is undeniably, legally, irrevocably yours. A place where you can be exactly who you are without apology or explanation. Use it however serves you best. Live here, rent it out, sell it if you want. The point is that it's yours to decide. I wish I could be there to see who you become once you're free from their shadow. But I have a feeling you're going to be extraordinary. You already are. You just might not know it yet. All my love, Grandma Ruth. I read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down my face, feeling like she was right there with me on the dock. She'd known. She'd seen everything, understood everything, and she'd tried to give me the tools to fight back even after she was gone. I folded the letter carefully and pressed it against my chest, looking out at the river she'd loved. "Thank you," I whispered to the evening air. "Thank you for seeing me." The summer faded into fall, and I made my decision. I quit my job in Portland, enrolled in a graduate program that would let me study remotely, and moved to the cabin full-time. It wasn't running away, I told myself. It was running towards something, toward the life my grandmother had given me permission to build. I turned the cabin into what I'd imagined, a retreat space for women who needed distance from toxic families, who were rebuilding their lives after estrangement or escape. I called it Ruth's Place, and I kept it small and selective, only hosting one person at a time, giving them the solitude and space to figure out their next steps. The first woman who stayed was named Jennifer, a 40-year-old who'd finally cut contact with her abusive parents and didn't know how to navigate the grief and relief that came with that choice. She spent 2 weeks at the cabin, and when she left, she hugged me hard and said, "This place saved me." That was when I knew I'd found the right path. My parents and I never fully reconciled. We reached a kind of cold peace, where we acknowledged each other's existence but maintained firm boundaries. My father sent occasional emails that I sometimes responded to. My mother and I didn't speak at all. Tori and I developed something resembling a relationship, careful and limited but real. We met for coffee every few months, talked about surface things mostly, occasionally dipping into deeper territory before retreating to safer ground. It wasn't what I'd once hoped for, but it was what was possible, and I'd learned to accept that. Marcus remained my constant, the person who knew all of it and loved me anyway. He brought his girlfriend out to the cabin one weekend, a sweet woman named Lisa who worked in environmental conservation, and I liked her immediately. Watching them together, easy and affectionate, I felt happy for him and only slightly envious. My own romantic life was non-existent, but that felt okay too. I was still figuring out who I was outside of my family's shadow. Romance could wait. Uncle Paul came for dinner one evening in October, bringing fresh salmon he'd caught and a bottle of wine. We cooked together in the cabin's small kitchen, and over dinner he told me stories about my grandmother I'd never heard, filling in pieces of her history I hadn't known. After we'd cleaned up and were sitting by the fire, he said, "You know, your father asks about you sometimes. Not in a pushy way, just wondering if you're doing okay." I stared into the flames. "What do you tell him?" He shrugged. "That you're better than okay. That you're building something good out here. That maybe someday he'll get to be part of it, but that's your choice to make." I nodded slowly. "Do you think I'm being too hard on him? Should I try to rebuild more of a relationship?" Uncle Paul was quiet for a moment, considering. "I think you're doing exactly what you need to do. Your father made his choices, and those choices had consequences. He doesn't get to skip past those consequences just because he's sorry. Real repair takes time and effort and proof of change. If he's willing to do that work, then maybe someday. But that's up to him to show you, not up to you to make it easy for him." It was exactly what I needed to hear. That winter, on the anniversary of my grandmother's death, I held a small ceremony at the cabin. Just me and Marcus and Uncle Paul and a few of the women who'd stayed at Ruth's place over the past months. We lit candles and shared stories about her, about what she'd meant to us or what this place had given us. It wasn't sad so much as grateful, a recognition that she'd set things in motion that were still rippling outward. That night, after everyone had left and I was alone, I walked out to the end of the dock despite the cold. The sky was clear and full of stars, the river black and smooth as glass. I thought about the girl I'd been a year ago, sitting in that emergency room waiting for a family that never came. I thought about the woman I was now, standing on property that was undeniably mine, doing work that mattered, surrounded by people who actually showed up. The journey between those 2 points had been brutal. It had cost me a family, a sense of belonging, the comfortable fiction that blood was thicker than water. But it had given me something too. Agency. Clarity. The knowledge that I could survive the worst kind of betrayal and come out the other side still standing. I pulled out my phone and opened my voice recorder, something I'd started doing to document this process, thinking maybe someday I'd write about it or use it to help others. I pressed record and started talking into the cold night air. This is Natalie Brooks, and I want to tell you about the night that changed everything. About the car accident that nearly killed me and the family who couldn't be bothered to pick me up from the hospital. About discovering that I'd been erased from their lives so thoroughly that they felt comfortable forging my signature to steal my inheritance. About fighting back, about taking them to court, about winning not just legally but personally. About learning that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is walk away from people who can't see your worth. I paused, looking up at the stars. If you're listening to this and you're going through something similar, if you're the forgotten child or the scapegoat or the one who's always made to feel like you're too sensitive, too needy, too much or not enough, I want you to know something. You're not imagining it. Your pain is real. Your experience is valid. And you don't have to keep setting yourself on fire to keep them warm. I stopped the recording and saved it, then stood there for a few more minutes in the quiet. Tomorrow I'd go back to work, back to helping the current guest at the cabin work through her own family trauma, back to my classes and my research and the slow, steady building of a life that felt authentic. But tonight, I just wanted to stand here and feel the weight of what I'd survived, what I'd overcome, what I'd become. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Just checking in. You good? I smiled and typed back. Better than good. I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. And for the first time in my life, that was completely true. The cabin stood behind me, warm and welcoming, filled with the ghost of my grandmother's love and the promise of all the people who would find refuge here. The river flowed past, constant and patient, wearing away rough edges with time. And I stood between them, no longer invisible, no longer erased, finally, fully, undeniably here. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.